Thank you, all of you, for inviting me to be with you today and talk to you. And I must say, I love the way that you've organized this with few speakers and time for discussion, etc., because these are incredibly serious times that we're in. The perfect storm is approaching. Biodiversity loss, desertification, climate change, these really are one issue. Without biodiversity loss, desertification, a fancy word for land turning to desert, doesn't occur. Unless we deal with desertification, we cannot address climate change. But to get one conference in the world where you could speak about these as one issue would be impossible. We are so compartmentalized in our educational system institutions. So you have separate organizations, separate conferences for biodiversity loss, mostly about charismatic species, separate conferences, university departments dealing with desertification, likewise climate change, but they're actually one issue. Now, we are going to fight wars over water that will make our wars over oil look like playground games. And earlier speakers have spoken very eloquently about that, the tremendous issues we face. Now, I haven't come to give you a doomsday talk. I'm going to offer great hope. In fact, I think greater hope than you ever could have had at any conference over the last 10,000 years. Right? So let's move right into it. Everything we're doing is based on agriculture. Without agriculture, you cannot have a church, an orchestra, a choir, an organization, an army, a government, a city. It is the basis of everything. Now, agriculture is not crop production. That is the mainstream thinking. Agriculture is the production of food and fiber from the world's land and waters. Wildlife, forestry, fisheries, these are all agriculture. Crop production is a small component of it. And crop production takes place on roughly 18 to 20% of the world's land surface. That leaves 80% under non-crop land agriculture. And if we look at it on the global scale with the oceans, the proportion of the land that is actually under crop production is very, very small indeed. Now, how are we doing with agriculture? We need about, that's not her weight, we need about half a ton of food for each of us a year to live a healthy life. But agriculture is producing more than 10 tons of soil for every human alive every year. Over 75 billion tons of eroding soil. We can't comprehend that figure, so it's about 10 tons per human. 20 times as much eroding soil we're producing as food we need. Not only that, agriculture is leading to the droughts, the floods, the poverty, the violence, recruitment to dissident organizations like Al-Qaeda, the emigration to Europe, the people dying in ships trying to get from North Africa to Europe, and I could go on and on. Agriculture is causing climate change. Agriculture is leading to all these things I've said. Without question, agriculture is the most destructive industry we have. More destructive than coal mining, oil, anything else. We don't have anything destroying soil, the very lifeblood of civilization, at this level. Okay, as I said, this is not a doomsday talk. I'm only going to talk in this, but we can get into question time, about the desertification, the middle part of this problem. Now, that is not occurring everywhere in the world. From space, we can see pretty generally where it's occurring in the red areas. And these are the areas where the rainfall is seasonal. In other words, it is not humid nearly every day of the year. We get very humid periods and then dry periods. And it is not only occurring where the rainfall is low, it's occurring where the rainfall is 80 inches of rain. That's quite high, okay, but it's seasonal. All right, so those are the areas that I'm going to talk about because they cover most of the United States and about roughly 2/3 of the world's land that is desertifying. Now, as I said, it's not occurring in the humid areas, it's occurring in the areas where it's very green at one time of the year, like this, and you watch this exact same spot 2 months later, and it's very different. So those are the areas where the problem is occurring, and that is much of your state, most of your state. All right, so what is desertification? It's a horrible long word for really something that's just a symptom of biodiversity loss. So it's not even a problem, it's a symptom. But let's talk about it. What is it? Really, it's making the available rainfall less effective. You've had a wonderful talk just before me about the seriousness of the loss of water or the lack of water in this country. This is a global problem. So let's look at where this problem starts. And this I never picked up in any textbook in the world. I had to walk out in the rain when I first became very concerned and try to work it out for myself, because we had a terrible drought in Botswana, South Africa, Rhodesia, paying out drought relief aid to farmers when I was still a researcher, but at the same time we had the International Red Cross collecting money for the flood victims in Mozambique. The same river system, the Limpopo River. And I couldn't help but say, how come we've got a drought and they've got a flood in the same years on the same river? So that began my quest to understand this more. Here's a picture I took in the Tihama Desert, man-made desert, all right, in Yemen. And I was doing a job for the World Bank there. We were close to a research station, and 25 millimeters, 1 inch of rain, was falling. So we knew the figure from the research station. Now, that's hard to figure exactly what that means. So think of it as drums of water, because you're all familiar with what a drum of water looks like. So that's 1,250 drums of water on every hectare of land that day. That's a hell of a lot of water. Where did it go? Because the next day, the land looked like that. And the broken piece in the foreground is where I had to use the keys of the car to break the soil surface. So where'd all that water gone? Let's look at it, because that's what's happening globally. If we have the soil surface, the rain that fell on it ran off. You could see some of it in the picture running off. What you couldn't see was the rest that soaked into the soil. Right now, immediately after the rain ends and the sun comes out, what happens? The runoff water is gone to give you your floods, and the water in the soil is now evaporating back to the sky straight out of the soil. So that rainfall was non-effective. It didn't mean we didn't get rain, it meant it had no effect. So what do we need? We need covered soil. We heard earlier how agriculture is driven by rainfall, or by the climate, by rainfall. No. Agriculture drives that, and then that drives agriculture. Nature functions in feedback loops. Desertification is not being caused by climate change. Desertification is causing climate change, which then exacerbates desertification, exacerbates climate change. It's a nature's feedback loop. And we can't tackle it up there. We've got to tackle it down here, where we can do something about it. So covered soil is the key to it. Now, if the soil is covered, let's look at what happens to the rainfall. Most of the rain that falls soaks in. Very little runs off because the rate of flow is slowed constantly by soil litter between plants, soil covering litter. And the water that soaks in now can move through soil, as you heard earlier, to river flows, springs, sponges, aquifers, etc., And the only way the water should leave the soil, ideally, is through the soil or through plants. That rainfall is now fully effective. And just for your interest, I calculated for New Mexico, where I spent about half the year, that if we just make 1 inch of rain more effective, very easy to do, as I'm going to show you, that would equal, for the next 1,000 years, more water than 3 dams the size of Elephant Butte, which was the biggest dam in the United States when it was built. Can you think of any cheaper way to get water? The soil is the biggest repository of fresh water that we have, greater than all the dams, lakes, anything. We are simply letting it go back to the sky. Now, all my life, this desertification was blamed on livestock. I was trained this, everybody is, everybody believes this. You can go back in ancient texts and see them blaming the nomads for creating the deserts with too many animals. Because I believed this, when I became a researcher and in the game department, trying to save game, I made a tremendous blunder, because as we started to set aside areas as future national parks, some of the most beautiful areas in Africa in the 1950s, immediately they began to deteriorate. And so logically, and like all scientists, we interpret the data to fit our beliefs. And I did the same, and I proved we now had too many elephants, too many buffalo, etc., because we had no livestock to blame. And my blunder led to culling 40,000 elephants. And it got worse. We were trying to bring the elephant numbers down to a level the land could carry, like range science has been doing all my life, trying to bring the cattle level down, or the sheep or the goats, to a level the land can carry. It's all false thinking. We brought those elephants down, 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 and it got worse. And if we'd carried on until we had the last elephant, it still would have got worse. We were completely wrong. All of us scientists had the bull by the udder. We were once equally certain the world was flat. We were wrong then, we're wrong again. All right, so let's look into this a little more and try to understand it. When we look at the public lands of the United States, you've had wonderful effort. Nobody's tried harder than you guys here. I used to follow all your research and everything from Africa, etc. When I got here, though, I got a shock to see public lands like this. Hardly an animal on the land. Millions of dollars, millions had been spent on developing machines to mimic animals, the Dixon imprinter, reseeding ranges, range management, etc., and yet public lands look like this. That is as bad as anything we've got in Africa. So something was going very wrong that we weren't understanding. And then I saw national parks like this. National parks, conservation, leave it to nature, but that's the result. So I began to realize, okay, conservation is working in humid environments. It's doing the opposite in the seasonal environments. You can come and visit us in Africa, and many people do, and we take them to the nearby national parks, partly because they'll see animals, lots of tame animals, but mostly to educate them, because some of the worst biodiversity loss is occurring in national parks. So we've got to rethink a lot of the stuff that we took for gospel. Then I looked at research plots that fortunately all over the western United States, from California right across, and I found consistently the same thing, where plots had been put in to exclude all animals, to show and prove that removing the animals would reverse the desertification. I found that the opposite happened. And you see it in this picture here, where this grassland that was green in '61, exact same spot, was looking like that by 2002. Now, I got this picture from the paper on position paper on climate change from International Range Society, all right? And that's where I got this. And the only explanation given in that paper for this is unknown processes. Now, what are those unknown processes? How did that get into a peer-reviewed paper without somebody questioning it? You see, our beliefs were just so deep, and we're all human, and we just couldn't see that we're wresting the land to death. The opposite of the worldwide belief. We just couldn't see it. The evidence was right in front of us all the time. All right, so when I deal with things like this now, I've just come back from the Arab Emirates, and you're dealing with millions and millions of acres of shifting sand dunes, etc., in what used to be savannas in the biblical times, and you can see why we blame too many animals. But that same area of the world, when we look from space, we can see what they call kites. And these are stone walls, some of them 6 kilometers long, from before crop production civilization as we know it today. And they're still there. And what these are stone walls that you can drive animals into a killing ground. Now, why on earth would people build 6 kilometer long stone walls and a killing ground, all that hand labor, if you didn't have millions and millions of animals to routinely harvest? No reason. So these areas that are sand dunes and deserts and have been for thousands of years, we realize, no, they were once productive savannas. All right, so what is going on? Here is a piece of grassland on the land that I live on in Africa so that I can keep my feet to the fire and live with the realities half the year. And we've just come through 4 months of rain. We've grown a lovely grassland, right? But then what happens? Look at the exact same spot and you watch it change over the next couple of months. All right, all of that grass that we've grown in that 4 months is now above ground dying. The plant is remaining alive below ground with millions of other organisms and so on. All right, now this dead material has to get out of the way before the next rains for the grass to grow again. If this dead material doesn't get out of the way, all right, then the grass starts to weaken and die because the sunlight can't reach its growth points. That's why trees have growth points up there where the sunlight can reach them. Grasses, majority of them, have them right at ground level. All right, so that's got to decay to get out of the way. If it doesn't decay, then it shifts from a biological rapid process to a chemical process and physical weathering that is extremely slow, extremely slow. I have seen dead perennial plants in an experimental plot in California that must have died 40 or 50 years ago, and they still haven't broken down. Just black like a rusting ship on the seashore. All right, so that oxidation, decay, turning to chemical process, humans observed that thousands of years ago. They observed that. And they said, to keep grasslands alive, we've got to get rid of that old muck. And that's still done in this state and other parts of the world. So what do we use? Humans only had 2 tools, technology and fire. All right, so which one are you going to use? Well, we'll use fire. So we burn that, and it does get rid of it, and we justify it because the green grass can flush. But that was rapid oxidation. That put pollutants into the atmosphere, that exposed the soil by ruthlessly burning the litter. That leads to the rainfall being less effective. More floods, more droughts, getting more and more severe. All right, so that's not going to work. So what else could we use? Technology? Very difficult. All right, so we've got to somehow do it. Let's look at alternatives. Technology, not a hope in hell. There is no technology even imaginable that could replace biological decay over 2/3 of the world every single year. I think we can forget technological solutions to climate change, this aspect of it which is so vital, and to our water solutions, etc. What about fire? No, it's not decay. It can't replace decay. What about resting the land, conservation? No, it causes the problem where the humidity is seasonal. It's the most powerful tool we have to restore decay and biodiversity where the humidity is perennial most of the year. So we're left with only one other thing: plant trees and grass. No, nobody's done it more than you have in the United States. And it doesn't work because it doesn't just replace biological decay, and civilizations have been doing that for thousands of years, trying to harvest water, plant trees and grass. Doesn't replace decay. Where do we go from there? Do you see why it seems such a hopeless situation? Why there's so much doomsday talk? Because there wasn't a solution. And many people got angry with me as a scientist for sticking my neck far out, because scientists don't do that, when I said we have no option. There is no option left to humans now, but the one I'm going to talk to you about. Let's go back and try and understand, before humans, how the world functioned. And these environments that I'm talking about are where the large grazing animals came from. They didn't come from the humid environments. Most of the grazing animals there were insects. Most of the predators there were tigers, jaguars, because they don't eat insects, so they're solitary. When we get to the seasonal environments is where the large grazing animals came from, and they were in millions. Why do I say that? Because all the large grazing animals have non-self-regulating populations. They cannot regulate the numbers. There are grazing animals that can, duiker, stembuck, oribi. They regulate the numbers, but they're solitary. They don't go in packs, and they're not large. When we look at the large grazing animals, they cannot regulate their numbers. They breed and breed and breed and breed, and their numbers are regulated by accident, predation, and disease. All right, so there were millions of them, numbers that we can't even comprehend today. But how did they function? Well, they functioned with a different kind of predator, pack-hunting predators that were extremely ferocious and would attack any grazing animal up to the size of an elephant. Nothing was immune from them. Now, what is the defense against these pack-hunting animals? Many of the females don't have horns, and the males have horns, but I often say they're like cowboys with big belt buckles and hats. They're not there to protect females, they're there for ego and other reasons. Okay, so the males didn't protect the females. The females, all of them, got into herds, and the larger the herd, the safer they were, because the pack hunter has to get the herd moving, has to get them running, has to separate an animal to kill it. And as long as they just stand in herds, they're safe. And you can see wonderful pictures of that, National Geographic and other things, where lions are just watching and the buffalo are just watching the lion. They're not panicking, they're just keeping an eye on it, and they're bunched. Now, when you bunch and you're a grazing animal, you cannot help it. You dung and urinate all over your own food. And no species likes to feed in their own dung and urine. So they had to keep moving. And it was that movement that prevented the overgrazing of plants, while their hooves, the dung and the urine, was keeping the rainfall effective and keeping the whole biological process going. Now, a Frenchman discovered that over 60 years ago, that overgrazing's got nothing to do with animal numbers. There is no science behind the thousands of PhD dissertations trying to link overgrazing to land degradation, and always relating the overgrazing to animal numbers. You cannot overgraze ranges. You can only overgraze plants. And plants being overgrazed is a function of time, not numbers of animals. And while plants are being grazed, browsed, or overgrazed or overbrowsed, the range is being rested or over-rested or partially rested, depending on the animal behavior. So this sort of thinking just wasn't on our radar. All right, so from what I've said to you, I hope you see the common sense of it, that there's only one option now to restore biological decay over 2/3 of the world's land every single year, save our cities, save our water situation, and that is the unthinkable. Use livestock. There isn't another option, and I would challenge any scientist in the world to please come up with another option if you say I'm wrong. I've been saying this for over 50 years. I think it's time to get serious about it. All right, so we're going to have to use livestock properly managed in some way. Let's see if what that would lead to. Take that same bit of grassland we looked at. This is the same piece. Now we'll simulate the animal behavior of the past, mimicking the pack hunters, keeping the animals bunched and moving. We move them across the foreground, and you see the change. Now all that dead material is on the surface as dung, urine, or litter, all right? Now whatever rain hits that can soak in, very little will run off and will tend to run clear, and whatever soaks in can only come out through the soil or through plants as they begin to flush green again. That is what we're needing over most of the world to solve these water, droughts, floods, climate change issues. All right, so we knew that, and I realized that in the 1960s, but then had a terrible dilemma. How were we going to do it? It sounds easily, but how are we going to do it? We'd had 10,000 years of extremely knowledgeable people who domesticated these animals, whose whole culture is their animals. And they had been bunching and herding their animals for 10,000 years and created the great man-made deserts. So we knew that things like mob grazing that's being promoted now in this country don't work. We knew that over thousands of years. So what are we going to do? Then we'd had about 100 years of modern range science, all right, with fencing and grazing systems, rotational grazing systems, many kinds. We'd had rotational grazing systems for roughly nearly 300 years in Europe. Voisin had studied those, and they weren't working even in the humid environments. People weren't picking up all the faults of them. You can get away with it because it doesn't turn to desert. So we knew that no grazing system ever devised or ever devisable could deal with this complexity. We knew that what we'd done as pastoralists for centuries hadn't dealt with it. So what were we to do? This was a terrible dilemma. We realized, or I realized, by then I was working with many people, that we had to deal with great complexity of seasons, erratic rainfall, planning for 2 years or more ahead, because we don't know what rain we'll get this year or the next. We've got to be planning for that. We had the different physiological stages of the animals through the year, different types of livestock running. We had all the wildlife on that same land that we were dealing with, cropping and other practices. So we're really dealing with a lot of complexity. And we scientists, range scientists, wildlife ecologists, we'd never dealt with anything like this. So rather than reinvent the wheel, I started looking at any profession I could. Fortunately, I'm not a specialist in anything. I became an independent scientist way back in the 1960s, just so that I was free to go across all disciplines and not have any dogma, just try to solve these problems. So I began looking at all professions, and what I found was there were planning techniques like Harvard Business School and so on, but they were way too academic, and impractical for our needs. They didn't deal with enough of the complications. And then, logically, I looked at the military and said, well, how have these guys done it? For 300 years in Europe, they've had to go through tremendous experiences in many, many wars. How do they deal with immediate battlefield planning? Today, right now, this week, in this battle, how do they deal with that? Because the goalposts are changing all the time. You have to train men rapidly in times of war. Everything's turning upside down. You're confused, you're stressed. How do they work out how to deal with that? Surely 300 years of experience, they've learned something. Lo and behold, they had. So I just took military planning, immediate battlefield conditions from Sandhurst, same as West Point, okay? And said, right, all I've got to do now is adapt that to what ranchers and pastoralists need. But I've got a problem now. They're always planning for a day, a week, whatever, short period in immediate battlefield conditions. We're not talking long-term planning here, but ranchers have to plan long-term. They have to plan 1 or 2 years. So how can I do that? And ranchers have got to plan in more than one dimension: time, area, volume, behavior. How can you do that? Oh, that was logical. Just put it on a chart. That worked. It worked from the very first rancher I did it with, Colin Bickle in Matabeleland. Within a week we had it working, and we've never ever had it fail. Because it's got 300 years work behind it. Damn it, it works. And a child can understand it. Now, that gave us planned grazing. And we began to get exciting results on 5 countries, in 5 countries around me that I was working in, with increasing numbers of ranchers, all right? But we also began to get some failures. Now, in science, unless we can get consistent results, something's missing. So this is management. It's not a hypothesis, but I said, let's treat it as a hypothesis. There's something missing still. So let's look at the failures that I'm getting. So looking at the failures, where is it occurring? And it wasn't occurring in the planning process. It wasn't occurring with the livestock. It was occurring in social issues, cultural issues, and economic issues. In other words, we'd have it all going right and there'd be a divorce. Oh my God, that's changed that ranch. And the whole thing would collapse, purely because of a divorce. Well, who thought of bringing that into planning? We didn't. Or estate planning. Suddenly somebody died, and the estate planning went to a bank, completely incapable of running the ranch, and so we had a collapse. Or it was an economic issue. One of the first ones that occurred to me, I was staying with a rancher, living with him while I helped him and planned him. I was only planning on his land, his cattle, his crops, his grazing, and he was talking at dinner about a soft loan. There was a soft loan from government to encourage irrigation. He was going to build a dam. He was going to grow cotton and other things. I'd been an irrigation farmer. I farmed, and I knew the dangers of that, and I started pleading with him to look at that carefully. And he said, oh, no, Allan, it's government's behind it, extension, everybody's behind it, soft loan. Cut a long story short, he went broke. There's very little such as a soft loan. There was the costs of diesel, the capital, the running costs. There was a lot of stuff he hadn't taken into account. So after that, I started saying, look, I don't help you unless we take everything into account. And that's when the word holistic came in. And we battled and battled and battled to get consistent results. About 1984, peace fell into place. And since then, we've been able to get consistent results. And that made me realize, oh my God, we've hit the tip of a much bigger iceberg. Because now we were bringing in the social, the economy, the culture, everything, but we realized, okay, this doesn't just apply to grazing, this applies to government policies, household, every walk of life where management is involved, because you cannot manage anything without automatically having to deal with social, cultural, environmental, and economic complexity. So we realized we'd hit the tip of a much bigger iceberg. And right now, I'm working on that. In fact, intend to get a short book out as quickly as I can on, we haven't given it a title yet, but it'll be about government and how the scientific reasons why no government in the world can govern well, and some structural reasons to try and give hope to younger generations for the future. All right, so back to this then. Once we'd got the holistic planned grazing, now we'd got the whole lot together, and from there we've been moving ahead. And now we are training semi-literate young women like this. She is training other villagers in Africa how to plan their grazing with their culture and everything else, and we're seeing the results from this. Let's show you a couple of results. Some of these I showed on the TED Talk. This is a piece of bare ground that I've known for a long time. This was on the road to my home, which was a 45,000 acre ranch further on, 25 miles further on, and I bought this ranch just to put my staff on so that I could keep the big one wild. So I used to drive through this and look at this bare ground, which worried me greatly. And this had been bare ground probably for 50 years before I got the place, and it was bare for 30 years that I knew it. And I've marked the tree, because on this ground now we've done nothing but holistic planned grazing, and there you see it. And we got that result by increasing the cattle, sheep, and goat numbers 400%. We couldn't have got this result continuing with low numbers of animals. It's very dramatic, and these, we've had over 500 sites like that on the property, and they've all been essentially the same result. And these are sites where we concentrate the animals very greatly because they were worst sites, because we run the livestock in a predator-friendly manner. We have lots of lions, elephants, buffalo, leopards, cheetahs, hyenas, wild dogs. We have them all, and we don't kill the predators because we need them. Any rancher should understand you need predators. They do nothing but good, and you can run livestock without having to kill them, as we've learned. All right, so these are sites where we bring the livestock at night into portable, predator-friendly enclosures. All right, now looking at another site similar to that, I've marked the bush in the background. This had been bare for all that time, and you can see the amount of soil loss was tremendous. All right, now that same site now looks like that. And again, that's just livestock, no planting, no technology, nothing, just handling the livestock differently as we can do today. This site in Mexico, I had to mark the hill. That's before we began, and this is a tank dam built to water the stock from harvesting runoff, and now it doesn't get that runoff, only occasionally, and most of the water is now remaining in the soil, going to river flow, etc. And the change has been pretty profound. And then here's a shot from the Karoo Desert in South Africa, and you can see the desert on the right and the land that's being reclaimed by greatly increasing the sheep in that instance to turn that back from desert to grassland. And then this is down in Patagonia. We're looking at the Patagonia situation where vast, vast areas are turning to desert. And the chap in the middle is a researcher who's been studying that for many, many years, got a lot of documentation of the increasing rate of land degradation as they steadily reduced livestock, same as we've done in this country. And then they, with their planned grazing, put 25,000 sheep in one flock on the planned grazing, and they got a measured 50% improvement in the production of the land in the first year. So once people are doing this and managing holistically, you can expect rapid results quickly and right across the board, economics, whole situation. Now in the Horn of Africa, which is a very violent region, as you know, we're training people there now, and it's wonderful because these people whose ancient, proud culture is livestock are openly now saying nothing is going to save their culture more than this, their language, their culture, everything. So it's not about livestock, it's about our lives, our cultures, our families, our Western culture. And the Western cowboy culture is dying, as you know. Look at the age of you in this room. That shocked me today. How many of you are under 25? Do you see the problem? One. And I'm in the departure lounge, so I'm really trying to appeal to young people. We're only going to remember the cowboy culture, the Western culture, in poetry, rodeos where professionals are riding, and museums, unless we get off our backsides and start doing something, I'm afraid. All right, so just in finishing then, I just want to remind you that we're not just talking about Oklahoma, where this is absolutely pertinent, what I'm saying. We're talking about the global situation, and in particular that big area right across North Africa up into China, which is our most problematic region of the world. And in that vast region, only about 5% of the land is cropland. 95% of the land can only feed people from animals. The significance of this is enormous. The political, military, economic significance of what I'm telling you is just mind-blowing. I'm saying to you that about 2/3 of the world's land is suffering from underuse, under-exploitation, not over, like the oceans and the wet areas are. So the significance is enormous. Now, we'll get into discussion time now, but I want to leave you one last thought. If we're going to do something about this, what can we do? And there is, I'm afraid, only one thing we can do, and that's talk to your neighbors, talk to your hairdresser, talk to your butcher, talk to everybody you can, because only by changing public opinion can we change our institutions and organizations. No organization, ranching organization, farming organization, university, government agency, no organization can change to such paradigm-shifting new scientific insights ahead of public opinion. Even if they want to change, they cannot. I cannot find a single instance in history from Galileo on where an institution has been able to change ahead of public opinion. So if we want to do something about this, we can only do it through shifting public opinion. Thank you.
We have lots of time for questions. I've got one right here to start off.
I'd like to know your thoughts if we can do this restoration with mono-species grazing. So typically we're cattle only here, and can we do it with mono-species, or do we have to have multi-species grazing to have these kind of results?
Yes, you can do it with mono-species, but you're better off with multiple species. Some of the most exciting results I've seen were in Mexico, where the guy was running sheep, cattle, goats, pigs, and horses. And the only problem was the pigs had to be removed when the sheep were lambing or the goats kidding. And it was a beautiful result. But no, you can manage holistically anywhere, any species.
I'm a little confused. I saw the thousands of sheep on bare land. How long do they remain there before you move them, because there's nothing for them to eat?
Yeah, I was asked that question a lot after the TED talk, okay, and before letting this loose on the public, we tested it in Rhodesia. I took Liebig's company, they were the biggest ranching company in the world, and they were clients of mine, and I said, look, this is what I propose to do, but everybody in the world says I'm wrong, so I don't want you to take any risk, because we had 60,000 cows on that particular ranch. So we took the worst land in the country, where I offered the chairman of the Cattle Producers Association a £5 note, that's about $10, if he could show me a single perennial grass plant in a 100-mile drive. Right, so we had trees, shrubs, leaf fall, that's about it. If we got rain, we'd get some annual weeds, and that was about what we had. So we took that land, and I said, just give me the worst of it, and let me show you what can be done. So they gave me 4,000 acres of that, and I said, now I want your most difficult animals to run. What are those? And it turned out to be first calving heifers. All right, I want first calving heifers on this, and I want to treble your stocking rate immediately on that bare ground, because I believe this will work. And we did that, and we just grew solid perennial grass. No reseeding, no range management, nothing, just the planned grazing. All right, how did we do that? It's like me taking this room and saying, okay, there's only enough to support the number of people in here now eating leaf fall, twigs, whatever. That's all the land can support, but it can support you for a year, and it's pathetically few numbers. If I divide the land in half, then it can support you for 180 days there. That lets their plants there start to grow. If I divide it in a quarter, then it can support you for 90 days in this quarter. That lets those plants grow for 270 days. Do you see the idea? So I just concentrated them onto a 30th of them at 3 times the stocking rate. So we got much more hoof action, but we were only there for a day or 2. And we planned the moves so that the plants had plenty of time to recover. So we immediately began to grow more plants, because it's the hooves of the animals that get the plants growing, not the mouth. And we controlled the feed of the animals by controlling the time, and we never looked back. And they were the highest performing cattle, and the entire thing cost us $1.80 an acre. Entire thing.
Okay, we've got another question right here.
On the 2 pictures that you showed, the land that you bought and you flagged the tree, and then the picture in Mexico, what was the time lapse between those pictures when you had vegetation then?
On the ones I showed you, the Mexico one, I'm guessing here it's about a 7-year time lapse on the Mexican one. The others, it's a 1-year, 2-year. Yeah, the result was immediate, and then I may have showed you the 2nd-year picture, but it's very close. And we've done that heavily impacting the worst sites where it's gulling and erosion. We've done that on, as I said, over 500 sites. The result is always the same. But what happens is, depending on when we impact it, if we impact it in the dry season, it responds the next rains, that rainy season. If we impact it in the rainy season, after about Christmas, because our rain ends about March, it will not recover until the following rainy season. That late part of the season is too short for it to recover. But it's covered with mulch and litter and dung, so no deterioration takes place, but the recovery is roughly a year later. It's consistently that pattern.
It sounds like from what you're saying, a lot of the work that you've done has been where you have several thousand acres that are contiguous. And you look in central Oklahoma, western Oklahoma, this part of the Great Plains, it might not be unusual for a producer to have, say, 5,000 acres, but it would be cut up into 160 acres here, 320 acres there. Has your system ever been tried in a management system like that, where you might have smaller units of pasture? And if so, what have the results been, and how would the management be done?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, what I'm talking to you has been done from the edges of the Namib Desert, where there's no rain, never rains, all right, to the Alto Paraná in Paraguay, where it's 100-inch rainfall. So it's been done on all climates, 5 continents, and everything from small mom-and-pop farms, terribly divided, to multi-million-acre ranches. It's absolutely universal, because there is no system. You see, you asked of my system. There is no system. We've abandoned management systems. They're a thing of the past. Let me clarify that for you. Everybody believes in grazing systems and so on. By definition, they will fail. That's why they do always fail. So what we're doing is replacing that with decision-making and planning process, which by definition works. Now, does that mean there's no room for management systems? No, it doesn't. There is room for management systems where everything is predictable. So if you're running a business, you want management systems for your accounting, for your inventory control, things like this, where everything is predictable and you don't want to get caught because they run out. But don't try to run the business on any management system because you'll fail. It cannot be prescriptive. So there is no place for prescriptive management. What we're doing is just replacing it with making your decisions socially, environmentally, economically right for you and your place. And that can be everything from the household to government policy.
So my question, my background is in social work, so I married into a farm and into agriculture. So within the process of planning that you were talking about for livestock, engaging success, how do you, within the approach, work with social issues? So in other words, how do you get to the outside, or how do you control for the outside factors that you discussed, the divorce, the death, and those issues to avoid failures? And is it a commitment to keep the plan in place no matter what the other factors are, or do you set holistic goals and then you use the system to, or the plan to achieve that success, I guess?
Okay, let me try and answer that without going into a whole lecture. Everything you look at in this room, everything, your clothing and everything, was made using technology and fire and expert opinion. All right? The clothes, you couldn't have made them without technology and fire. The fire to make the machinery that made the clothes. I don't know how to make a watch. I don't know how to make a jacket. So everything we make needs expert opinion, expertise, uses technology, and it is complicated. Way too complicated for my mind. Computers, space travel, all of this. But none of it involves complexity. Okay? Complexity is human organizations, families, etc., and nature, where things are self-renewing, where you cut off my arm, I don't stop living. I live on, but without my arm. A chairman of your organization dies. The organization doesn't die. You replace the chairman. Part in a watch stops. The watch stops. Do you see the difference? So you're dealing with self-organization and complexity without going more into it. So everything we manage is where we're running into trouble. Our technology is getting better and better, better cell phones, everything. We're getting more exciting space exploration and so on. That's not where we're running into trouble directly. Where we're running into trouble is global finance, global economies, deserts advancing, violence, all of these things, and all of those involve management. All right, so in any management situation, and this was the big aha in '84 when I was trying to get the social, economic to come together, was realizing that everything we do has an objective. So I had an objective in getting this coat. You had an objective in coming here. You cannot make a human decision without an objective. It just doesn't work. Other than if your hand touches a hot stove, you'll just pull it away. All right, an objective needs a context. If I say to you all, I'm going to light fire. Has somebody got some matches? I'm going to light a fire. Should I? You have no idea. Until you ask me why. When I tell you why, I tell you the context. It's to cook our food in the stove. Okay. If I'm just going to light a fire on this inflammable carpet, I'm going to burn the place down. What is the objective of every agricultural policy in the United States? Many objectives. Many objectives. What is the context? Do you know? They don't even know. There's no context. So you see why every agricultural policy in the United States is failing. It had to fail because it had no context. It's so profoundly simple. The drug policy in the United States, what's the objective? Well, there are many objectives. Build a wall on the Mexico boundary, use drones, use military people, blah, 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 make strict laws. Okay, but what was the context? There wasn't a context. It was so inadequate. It's just that our kids are using too much drugs. Well, what are the unintended consequences? We've now got more people in jail than Stalin had at the height of his reign in America. And drug use has increased, and violence has spread to Mexico and now through to Africa. These are the unintended consequences. So if we want to put things right, like you were hearing from the previous speaker, if we want to put agriculture right, we want to put any of these right, if you want one simple thing that'll put it right, is just enough public demand that management policies be holistic. And we will begin to put it right, because there's amazing knowledge in this country, in this room. There's just astounding knowledge. And when so many people have worked in agriculture for so many thousands of years, and we end up producing 20 times as much eroding soil as food, with brilliant universities and brilliant people, it's telling you something systemically wrong. It was how we form policies. And tragically, our institutions cannot change until public opinion changes. Even if they want to change, they cannot.
Mr. Savory,
So
over
public
here.
opinion is where it lies.
Okay, we've got a question on this side of the room.
Thanks. So this is probably a little less a play question. I'm wondering, you advocate for increasing your the livestock rate on those properties, and I guess apart from all the livestock that you have to deal with, you have to process. I wonder how's the methane how are the methane emissions by, say, cattle comparing against the CO2 emissions that you save by keeping the grass on the ground? Do you have any sort of comparison for that?
Yeah, this is booming a bit in my ears. I didn't quite get the first bit about the cattle increasing or something. What was the question there?
I was just saying, you said a couple of times that you had to increase your stock rate on the land in order for it to sort of be maintained.
Okay, I think I've got it. Yeah, you don't have to increase the stocking rate, but if you're looking at the economics of a ranch, then you need to, because the most vital thing for profit, which most ranchers are wanting, is not the breed of cattle, not the conception rate, not the weight gains, not all of the stuff that ranchers brag about. It's just simply the stocking rate. Okay, the yield of meat per acre. That's what matters most. Now, grain farmers, forget all the things that might be wrong, etc. They've got it. If you meet them in the pub or anywhere, they don't brag about the number of rows of corn, the size of the corn. They don't brag about that. They brag about the bushels per hectare or per acre. If you meet ranchers in the pub or anywhere, what do they brag about? The breed of cattle, the conception rates, the weaner weights, etc., and they wonder why they're going broke. Stocking rate is number one, far more important than any of these. So if you can take the average ranch that I've worked with around the world and immediately double the stocking rate, you do more economically, more good than anything else you can do. So we try to get the stocking rate up as rapidly as we can, and the moment you are doing the planned grazing, you can do that safely, because you'll be planning it. You'll be planning exactly how many animal days per acre you're taking off, what you've got there, what your estimates are. So that'll be done quickly. Now, the other issues that come up frequently, there are three in the world, because I'm speaking in many countries. One is the methane. People that are antagonistic to livestock will raise it, the amount of methane that cattle put off. The other is the amount of carbon that the grassland soils can absorb. So there's a lot of debate about that, how to measure it, can the grasslands really absorb the carbon, and so on. And then the other one is the diet, the number of people who are saying you've got to cut down the meat consumption, etc., and don't eat as much meat. Now, these three issues are endangering humanity, all right? Let me try and illustrate that. Let's assume for a moment that cattle put out 20 times the methane that they do. Let's just take that as a given. Let's assume for a moment that the grassland soils, which is the bulk of the world's land, could absorb no carbon. Let's assume that for a moment. We know it to be totally untrue. And let's assume that every human decided to become a vegan and nobody would eat cattle. I still come back to what I stood there and told you, you have no option. If you want to deal with floods, water for your cities, droughts, violence, poverty, and climate change, you've still got to use livestock. There isn't another tool available to humans. We're a tool-using creature, and the only tools we've ever had is technology, from the Stone Age to modern technology, an artifact of the human mind, and fire, for 99% of human existence. Sometime about 10,000 years ago, we developed the idea of wresting the land as a tool. And the only other tool we've ever had is microorganisms to make cheese and wine, when we didn't know what they were, and then now we can genetically engineer species. So you have all the creativity in the world, all the money in the world, all the labor in the world, and none of you here can even drink water unless you go to the nearest river and put your mouth to it without using technology. So we've got to use some tool, and there is no tool there except livestock, which we've had to add. So there is no option, and the more years we waste on talking about how much carbon, we've got time to work those out. But every year we waste now is endangering humanity more.
We have one more question right here at the back side of the room.
Thank you. Please forgive me for being naive. So what I'm understanding is that we need these migrating animals to help with water retention, and only that is how we'll be able to restore these lands so that we can farm them.
Can you hold your...
Yes, so that they can be farmed, we can raise food. Is this, am I on the right track so far? So what concerns me is, in order to be successful with this, it sounds like we can't compartmentalize ranching and farming any longer, that it has to be done cyclical, and so ranchers may have to become farmers, farmers may have to get into ranching. So if that's the case, what do the ranchers do today? What is the answer? Is it just the first step, a political approach to try and get policy changes? I mean, what's a practical implication, I guess, for some of the people in this room and in ranching?
Okay, if I've got it, if you're ranching, let's assume some of you are ranchers in the room, what can you do? You can change yourself. You can begin to get information. We're building hubs. We're encouraging the formation of locally led, locally managed hubs around the world, whereas you cannot wait for political leadership to come from any institution. It's got to come from ordinary people now, okay? And so we're encouraging these hubs where people in their individual capacity, be they in university or government agencies or on ranches or whatever, can be working together, managing holistically, learning what that means, how that can be carried into policy or homes or anywhere, because management needs to be holistic, embracing science. No question of it. I don't think any scientist would argue that. All we've done is discovered how to do it. So you can begin to do that, get into hubs. There needs to be an Oklahoma hub. There is so much interest around the world. We ran a conference in Boulder last year, and we had 10 nations there, from Turkey to the Swedish countries to Patagonia, all over. The interest is so great now that we've got something like 90 countries, and we've moved the conference this year to London to make it easier for them to come. So this is happening around the world now, just locally led, locally managed hubs where people can start working together and get this knowledge permeating. So that's something you can do as a rancher. And then the other thing is just speak, speak, speak. Because remember that I don't think there's anything ever offered more hope for the Western ranching culture, Western ranching families and everything. But don't forget that not a single cattleman's organization, ranching organization, has yet supported me. They cannot until enough rancher public opinion changes. They cannot. You must remember that. So just start talking to people.
Excuse me. Okay.
We raised cattle in Colorado. We had 1,300 acres, 800 irrigated, and we used your techniques. And it went from a ranch that had been overworked with machinery and haying and things doing intensive rotational grazing behind hot wires, putting those 200 cattle in very small paddocks, moving them daily, watering behind it. In 5 years, we had excess grass and no more water than we always had. We were irrigated by gravity flow off the mesa, but it works, people. I don't know about Oklahoma. I've just been back in Oklahoma for a few years, and not ranching now, but try it. It works. We had to run horses behind the cattle later on.
Thank you. I had to pay her a lot to come and say that.
Let's thank Mr. Allan Savory one more time.
Thank you. Thank you.